The recent global debate about removing statues both here in the UK and in the USA and further abroad has really brought to light a long-standing argument about removing statues and the discussion over the validity of statues as cultural objects. Unfortunately, it's also brought a load of really hackney old cliches out of the woodwork. The removal of statues of men like Colston, Milligan and other slave owners and slave traders in the UK has followed a longer term removal of controversial figures, Confederate statues and monuments both in the USA and further abroad. But is there any validity to the idea that removing these statues is erasing history? That's a big slogan that people are using right now, and frankly it's not a good one to use if you're fighting on the internet with historians. But who the hell am I to be making a video on this subject? I'm just a guy on the internet who dresses up in Viking clothes, right? Well, I have a master's degree in archaeological studies by research that involved looking at how historical buildings can be reused in the modern world and how we assess their validity and how important they really actually are to our culture. I'm also studying for a PhD right now, and the subject of my PhD is looking at objects in different communities and how their importance fluctuates over time. It also looks at how other communities and groups see those objects and interpret them and put importance on them. So when I'm not acting or dressing up in Viking clothes, this is kind of my jam. Now, if you're one of the many people who are genuinely upset and concerned by statues being removed right now, you are not stupid. That's not the point of this video essay. I am not trying to say that you don't have a right to feel however you do. You absolutely have a right to feel however you do and to believe what you believe. But there are a few questions that I think you need to ask yourself. The first question I want you to ask yourself is, why is this statue important to you specifically? Now, it's really difficult to get a statue built in the UK at the minute. Most cities have what they call a saturation zone. And a saturation zone is a place where there are so many statues, you have to have a damn good reason to apply to the local council to build another one. You're much more likely to get something like a plaque built, like this one. And this is a really good plaque. It actually has quite a lot of info on it. It tells you who it is, what they did, and why you should care about them. We have a lot of statues here in the UK, and most of them are to people that you don't care about and you've never heard of, and you probably won't bother going home and looking at their Wikipedia page to find out who they were, because history big. You have a busy life. The thing about this plaque that I just showed you is it's a good educational tool. It can be used to help teach a little bit about history. The statue of Churchill in Westminster, the statue of Edward Colston, and even Nelson's column don't really do any of that. They just have a name most of the time and a date of erection. They might as well just be a portrait painting hanging in an old house somewhere. Now, Edward Colston wasn't a popular man in Bristol in the 19th century. Nobody really cared about him. Nobody really wanted the statue to be built. His statue was erected by a few wealthy members of the city, basically to show that they had the money to build a statue. I mean, it's only been there since 1895, and ever since then there have been calls to pull it down or move it. Now, the statue was actually going to be removed anyway. Bristol City Council had, as far as I know, already approved its removal, but they were dragging their feet because a few people were effectively blocking the action. But the plaque on it doesn't actually tell us much. It's the most self-aggrandizing Victorian nonsense that you could hope to find to prove this point. All it says is that it was erected by the citizens of Bristol to recognise one of their city's most virtuous and wisest sons. Really? Because he was co-governor of the single largest slave trading company in the history of the world, the Royal Africa Company. They were responsible for the deaths of around 19,000 people in just the decade that Colston was involved with them. Does the statue tell us any of that? No, it doesn't mention any of that. He also owned a sugar plantation, and that meant that he had directly slaves and enslaved people as his property. So all the people saying, oh, but he didn't directly buy slaves at an auction, really could do with reading up a little bit on how level the commercial industrial slave trade worked in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now here's a sub-question for you in this first question. Did you use Nelson's column to learn history? And I don't mean when your dad took you to London for the first time and pointed at it and said, that's Nelson, he won the Battle of Trafalgar. I mean, did the object itself teach you anything about the man that it commemorates? The answer to that is no, it doesn't. It doesn't tell you anything about what he thought, what his opinions were, or what other people's opinions were of him at the time. It just tells you that at least somebody with enough money commissioned a statue to him. That's all that object can tell you. It certainly doesn't give you an in-depth look at a man who supported the colonial system and was a vocal pro-slavery anti-abolitionist. Now, because I don't just want to be another angry man on the internet tearing apart all of your history heroes, I'm going to put some money where my mouth is here and prove this a little. In 1805, Nelson wrote a letter to his friend Simon Taylor, who was also part of the slave trade, saying that he had ever been and would ever be a friend of the current colonial system. He also claimed that William Wilberforce and his abolitionists would result in the murder of, quote, all our fellow citizens and friends in the colonies. He was wrong. Obviously, that was a stupid thing to claim then, and it's a stupid thing to defend now. There was no white genocide because Britain abolished slavery. Now, some people are using that was the argument at the time, that was the attitude at the time argument. But that doesn't really stand up to this either, because Nelson wrote that in 1805, at a time when the abolitionist movement had already been going strong for at least 30 or 40 years. That was his attitude at the time. That wasn't the attitude at the time. History is really complicated, but we're going to go on to that a little bit later. But you can see already that argument doesn't stand up to basic criticism. And even if that was the dominant attitude of the time, it certainly wasn't the attitude of enslaved people in the 18th and 19th centuries. But hey, who cares about the contemporary opinions of black enslaved Africans, right? What did they ever do that deserved a statue or a column? The attitudes have changed argument is so easily debunked these days, it shouldn't really even be part of anybody's arsenal. Just two more examples of early abolitionists, even before Nelson's time. Pope Innocent XI, who, after a petition from a representative of a Brazilian anti-slavery movement, banned and outlawed slavery in the 1680s. That's nearly 200 years before it was banned in the USA. Olaudah Equiano, who in the later 18th century, 1780s and 90s, wrote British newspaper editorials and articles and books about anti-slavery opinions. He also published an autobiography about his time as a slave to British Navy officers. It isn't a positive experience that he had. But you know what Nelson looks like, and I'm willing to bet none of you know what Olaudah looks like, or looked like. There's no statue to him. People are also up in arms right now about the graffiti on a statue of Winston Churchill in London. Why? Because criticism isn't welcome there. You cannot criticise Churchill. Winston Churchill was the British bulldog. He embodied everything about Britishness that we love. He won World War II against the Nazi menace for the underdog Brits, and he did it with a cigar in his mouth and a drink in his hand. Except he was also a vocal, outspoken, racist, Zionist, eugenicist, white supremacist. Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, who was also a contemporary politician of Churchill's, said that when it came to India, Churchill's ideas were, quote, not quite sane. He also said that when he looked at Churchill's attitudes towards race and Hitler's attitudes towards race, he couldn't tell the difference. And that was in a private diary. But just because it's scary doesn't mean that it's wrong and that I'm automatically making things up about a historical figure that lots of people admire. I admire a great deal about Churchill. His public speaking and writing abilities were inspirational. His ability to write is, frankly, out of this world. But he was into eugenics and believed that white Aryan people's genetics were superior to people of colour. He said some pretty horrendous things about a lot of people, especially the Indians. He said that they bred like rabbits, and he called them, quote, a beastly people with a beastly religion. He also said, quote, the Aryan stock is bound to triumph. And because of his policies, millions of Indian people starved to death. Now, are we allowed to talk about that aspect of Churchill? Are we allowed to talk about his eugenics, his white supremacy, and his racism? Yes, of course. They're aspects of him. The whole argument of erasing history can't be one-sided and cherry-picked. If we're going to talk about people, let's talk about all of them. Let's talk about the bad as well as the good. Why shouldn't we remember that Churchill said horrific things, called for terrible human rights abuses, and was a racist? Does that erase him from history by doing that? No. It gives us more to look at. It gives us more history to talk about when we talk about these figures. Is he suddenly going to be forgotten if we took his statue down right now, this second? But beside all that, if we were to pull down the statue of Churchill right now, this second, would that erase any part of his history? No, he'd still have had a statue put up to him. He'd still have been the person he was and done the things he did. All that forms his history. But if we put up a statue to Mahatma Gandhi, or to the millions of people who died in India from starvation as a result of his policies, does that erase his history? No. Of course it doesn't. All of that is a part of his history. We wouldn't be saying that he won the war and was a saint for a change. We'd have another angle on him. We'd be saying he was an imperfect man. He was a human being with faults. Just like we have to realise about every single person in history that we hero worship. They're all as fallible as you or I. Removing a statue in Bristol to a man who had a huge part in the international slave trade is probably the most important thing that that statue has actually done in its 125-year history. And the removal of statues in the United States goes back a lot further than just the Black Lives Matter movement. See Atun Che's latest film on YouTube for that. I'll put a link to it. It's actually a very, very good film, but it does concentrate on the American Civil War, which I'm not positioned to do. All of these people, as I've shown with the Churchill example, were criticised, disagreed with, assessed and judged in their time by their contemporaries. History that we write is just a continuation of that criticism and that assessment of these people and their actions. And as for the whole, do we have to pull down all of the buildings named after slave owners argument? No, because as the web-based movement Topple the Racists so eloquently puts it, obviously they can be renamed. You can't rename a statue to somebody to make their bad influence on the world disappear. That's not how it works. But you can take away a little of the credit that they've been given and replace that with a little bit of fair criticism of their actions. You can remove a slave owner's name from a building that was built using the profits generated by the deaths of millions of people. So my third question that I want people to ask themselves on this subject is, why do you think history is so simple? History is a complicated, bloody, difficult thing full of knots and pain and differing opinions and egos. And historians and archaeologists take an awful lot of time and training to be able to pick through those to actually get some facts out of the damn thing. History is written by the victors is something that we really have to remember. Now there's a counter-argument to that, which is, oh, but there was white slavery. Yes, there was. There was white on white, white on black, black on white, black on black slavery. But which of those involved the institutional and industrial removal of more than 10 million people from their continent over 300 years, was defended with legislature and out-and-out warfare up until the 1860s, and it still has social, political and financial reverberations in the most powerful country on earth to this very day? Exactly. And this is an industry that only ended in the Victorian period. I have to reinforce that. This is something that started before Shakespeare was born and ended when we had steam trains. That's insane. But what about the UK? We didn't have Jim Crow laws here. We didn't have the institutionalised disenfranchisement of black people. That's absolutely true. But what we do still have here is all of those streets that I mentioned. All of those buildings, all of those places named after people who owned slaves. They owned people. Britain's big, beautiful cities wouldn't look how they did. London wouldn't look like this without the 18th century slave trade. Heck, Scotland's economy tanked until it got involved with the British Empire's slave trade in the 18th century. Renaming things and removing things doesn't mean erasing history. It means making history. It changes the way our landscape and our minds work when we look at the past. And it's been going on for centuries. centuries. It just gives us more angles and it makes more layers of history. Now, we're still rebuilding our history in the UK from when the Victorians whitewashed and sanitised it. Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare isn't real Shakespeare. The Victorian history books that inspired the 20th century history books don't tend to mention the millions that we killed in the slave trade, the guns that were sent from Britain to both sides during the American Civil War. They don't tend to mention the fact that the British Empire invented concentration camps and starved millions of Indians to death. We are still working on rebuilding our history. And British people are being listened to on this. People seem to think that this is some Orwellian culture where nobody who thinks right is being silenced, but nobody's being silenced on this issue. There are people spouting right-wing, left-wing, centrist, educated, uneducated, informed and uninformed viewpoints on everything that's happening in the world right now. And that is because we don't live in an Orwellian society where wrong-think is automatically silenced. You have your platform, whatever your point of view. You have the right to your voice. You don't have the right to be agreed with if somebody has proof that what you're saying is empirically wrong. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people things they don't want to hear. George Orwell, from the introduction to his 1945 edition of Animal Farm. Modern issues stem from history. History isn't a brick wall. When you tear down a statue, you don't remove a brick from the wall of history that's ground up, thrown away, and never heard of again. History's more like a tree. It's as broad and as deeply rooted as the whole of the shared human experience. Statues are more like the leaves on that tree. They turn up, they fall off, but that's not the end of their story. They can still create even after they're destroyed. A statue can still be remembered. Photographs of it can still be used to illustrate the hate or the love for that statue that it was given when it was still standing. Leaves can be mulched to turn into nutrients for future trees. They can be saved, made into artworks, pressed in books, eaten by animals. History is complicated. History is deep. And history is tough to be on the right side of. But it's very difficult to destroy history. It's much easier to make it. And I truly hope that I and all of you watching end up on the right side of it in a few decades' time. But that's not for me to decide. That's for history to decide. I'm going to go ahead and put some links in the description to this video to some useful sources and resources. I know a lot of the people watching this don't have access to some of the paywalled academic sites, so I'm really sorry I can't provide you with more of the academic, scholarly side of this, but I've tried to find some good balanced resources here, some good articles, some journalism, some academic, and some primary sources like that letter from Lord Nelson. So I hope that they can be something of a jumping point for you guys if you want to do some further research. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope it's been useful to you. I hope it's given you something to think about. Please do subscribe to the channel if you'd like to. I intend to do some more of these video essays in future if they prove popular. I tend to post my videos once a week, sometimes twice. So once again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.